Nearly a year ago, at the beginning of 2022, the Russian armed forces deployed tens of thousands of troops into Belarus, a relatively small country of about 9 million people whose government is a very close ally of the Kremlin and whose territory is immediately to the west of Russia and to the north of Ukraine.
Hey Joes, welcome back to the channel. My name's Ryan. I'm a former Royal Marines Commando from the United Kingdom, and today we're going to be reacting to why Belarus might invade Ukraine too. It's going to be a good video, this, guys. The original link will be in the description as always. I'll say thank you to these channels who create these videos, because without them, we couldn't react to content like this. Why is it important that I'm reacting to this type of content? Well, I can give a different perspective on things. Being a Royal Marine, we were quite specialised in amphibious infanteering, but also, you know, we were pretty good at generic infanteering as well across the land. Afghanistan proved that. So let's get straight into this one, guys. Before we get into it, please like, share and subscribe to the channel. I really do appreciate it. Boom, let's do it.
Belarus's southern border with Ukraine extends for more than 1,000 kilometers across largely flat, open and marshy terrain, and is crucially placed fewer than 90 kilometers away from Ukraine's capital and largest city, Kyiv. These facts make Belarus a vitally strategic location for Russia's invasion plans into Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at that area, we've got the whole, pretty much most of the northern flank there covered by Belarus. The rest of it is covered by Russia. So it hasn't got any friendly northern borders, has Ukraine, when you think about it.
And so, after Belarus allowed the Russians to pile up around 30,000 of their troops on the southern border in February of 2022, the Russians launched their initial blitzkrieg attack by storming across the border towards Kyiv. Their objective was to quickly occupy and conquer the Ukrainian capital, overthrow the government of Volodymyr Zelensky, and force a quick end to the war on Russia's own terms, which would have likely involved establishing a puppet government in Ukraine that would have granted the Russians their desired territorial conquests in the east.
Yeah, those oblasts weren't taken as effectively as Russia initially thought it was. I believe in my own, wholeheartedly that Russia generally thought in its own brain that they could take Ukraine within a matter of months, and that hasn't happened. Here we are in 2023. Probably is going to go through the rest of this year with the same story in mind, troops.
But of course, that's not how things ended up turning out. Ukrainian resistance was significantly fiercer than the Russians had anticipated, while the Russians' own logistics, planning, equipment, and morale proved significantly worse than they initially believed. After suffering thousands of casualties and failing to capture Kyiv, the surviving Russians withdrew back across the border towards the safety of Belarus, and left a path of scorched earth behind in their wake, like in Bucha, where hundreds of civilians and prisoners of war had been hastily shot. But Russian missile systems and artillery based within Belarus have continued to bomb targets within Ukraine throughout the months of the war that have followed. And now it appears that yet another Russian attack from Belarus against Kyiv may be building and coming very soon.
Right, so this video was a month ago. Things are changing quick in Ukraine. What I want to know is, where does Belarus go post-war? Okay, they're not going to be too close to Ukraine, that's for sure. But what happens if, for instance, Ukraine manages to push Russia out of this situation? How does Belarus respond? How do they, act in and around? Do they just go around their day-to-day business as if nothing happened? It's a dodgy neighbour to have in the northern flank, guys, all right? There's got to be ramifications for these guys as well. Sanctions as well.
Western satellite images have revealed increasingly concentrated military activity within Belarus near to the Ukrainian border. It's now estimated by Western intelligence that around 20,000 Russian troops have entered the country once again and are massing in the south near the border with Ukraine. Railways from Russia have been flowing through Belarus with military hardware and equipment, and brand new roads are being sliced through the forest towards the border. These are all troubling signs that could be pointing towards a second Russian attack from Belarus on the Ukrainian capital nearly a year after the first attempt failed. And there are fears that this time, the Belarusian army itself may be joining in alongside the Russians in the attack.
Belarusian soldiers haven't really got that much of a choice, though, when you think about who's on their border, all right? They haven't really got a choice to say no to Russia when, in fact, they've seen what Russia is doing to Ukraine right now. If they say no, effectively, that's going to be them, okay? And have they got the might to be able to withstand an invasion from Russia? I don't think so. Many would agree with me. Some may disagree, but I'd appreciate your feedback in the comments, irrespective.
But if that's true, why has it taken this long for Belarus, a nominal ally of Russia, to formally join the Russians in the invasion of Ukraine? Why has Belarus continuously granted the Russian military safe passage through their country and access to their bases to attack Ukraine from without formally committing their own troops alongside them? And why might that all suddenly be changing now? To answer those questions, we just have to go back a couple years to the events that took place in Belarus during 2020. But in order to understand those events, you have to understand a bit about the man who rules over Belarus. You see, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union back in the early 1990s, Belarus has only ever been ruled by a single man, Alexander Lukashenko. He came to power in the first and only free election ever to be held in Belarusian history in 1994, and is claimed to have won every single election in the country ever since.
Of course he's claimed that. And it's always the fat guys too as well. He's managed to stay in power and win every single election, he says. It's always the same story throughout time. These dictators doing the same thing by the same means as well. So, yeah, I'm not going to be too surprised with him supporting Putin and his ventures and endeavors. But two, he's a coward. He isn't going to resist in any way, shape or form, and he's allowing safe passage at this moment in time for Russian troops to pass through their borders into Ukraine. So Belarus is the enemy in, you know, in terms of what they're doing and how they're conducting what they're doing.
A claim that much of the rest of the outside world ardently disagrees with. He has self-identified as the last dictator in Europe, while his regime in Belarus has often been considered as Europe's most heavily authoritarian. His ideology and goals have been to effectively preserve Belarus as a miniature surviving version of the Soviet Union. Large amounts of the Belarusian economy are still owned by the state. The flag used by his regime is essentially the same one that was used by the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, with the only significant modification being the removal of the old hammer and sickle. The regime has sidelined the Belarusian language in favor of Russian. Both are technically official languages of the state, but by 2020, nearly 90% of children in Belarus were attending Russian language schools. And Russian remains the dominant language in nearly every aspect of public life, making it really the de facto language of the country. According to a Belarusian government study from 2009, only 12% of the Belarusian population actively used the Belarusian language at all, while the overwhelming majority used Russian. The Belarusian State Security Service even kept its old name and acronym from the Soviet era as well, the infamous KGB.
So they're saying it's like a de facto language. It's effectively like a de facto Russian country. Well, it's all quite obvious that's what it is, but they're extremely loyal with their ties to Russia, it seems. Just off this first 4.5 minutes, you can tell that that's quite clear. They're symbolic to Russia in everything they do, their actions, their support and policies, and they're certainly supporting the political leaders of Russia. It's as if the two of the same. So in the United Kingdom, the only thing I could kind of equivalent it to is, and it's a little bit different, is like Wales and Scotland to England. Okay, yes, they're part of the United Kingdom, but if we weren't suddenly part of the United Kingdom, would you feel too different? Being Welsh and English, yes, you've got your own uniqueness, but I think in times of need, we would support each other. Okay, that's where I think this comes down to. Similar situation.
Freedom of the press and civil liberties are each low, as insulting Lukashenko personally is punishable by up to a 5-year prison sentence, while criticizing the Belarusian government from outside of the country is punishable with up to a 2-year prison sentence.
Okay, so I said he was a bit fat. Does that mean that I could be punishable? I don't know.
In 2021, Reporters Without Borders ranked Belarus 28th from the bottom out of all the world's countries on press freedoms, nearly on a par with Taliban-controlled Afghanistan.
Wow.
And in addition to that, Belarus is also the final country in Europe to continue administering the death penalty for crimes, most often carried out by a single gunshot to the back of the head. More than 30 years now after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Belarus remains a pocket of Soviet-era authoritarianism in the center of Europe. And
you know what makes me happy to be part of the UK? The freedoms that we have here that we can exhibit is astronomical, and we do need to appreciate those freedoms. We live in a society right now where those freedoms can be abused, you know, freedom of speech and everything. Yes, freedom of speech, but not freedom of consequence. I think we need to toe the line a little bit more. But the likes of Belarus, it seems to be very much archaic in the way they do their things, very much not wanting to step away from the old way of doing things. It might be, like you said, even a gunshot to the back of the head. It just seems a little bit barbaric to me, but they want to continue to live that way because rich men in high positions can prosper when you live that way.
That means that, consequently, Lukashenko has kept his Soviet nostalgic authoritarian regime very closely aligned with the similarly authoritarian and Soviet nostalgic
Wow, that's a massive country when you're looking at
regime of Vladimir Putin in Russia. And that's why in 1999, Belarus and Russia signed a treaty that established what's known as the Union State between them. The original goal of that treaty was to eventually unify both Russia and Belarus back into a single new state. A sort of first step towards rebuilding something out of the Soviet Union's many shattered pieces. And in the decades ever since, there have been a lot of attempts to move closer towards that goal. Russian and Belarusian citizens are each allowed to freely travel, live, and work in each other's countries as if they already are a unified state. The Russian and Belarusian armed forces frequently conduct joint military exercises together, while their officers are often trained together in the same schools. There have also been talks going back decades now of establishing a common currency between Russia and Belarus, like the euro in the European Union. But all those talks have so far ultimately led to nowhere, just as the talks for eventual full-on unification between Russia and Belarus. But nonetheless, Lukashenko's Belarus has remained closely aligned with Russia in nearly every conceivable measure just short of full-on unification. Belarus is, after all, a member of the Russian-led military alliance CSTO, essentially Moscow's own version of NATO consisting of multiple states that used to be a part of the Soviet Union. Simultaneously, Belarus is also a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is basically Moscow's own version of the European Union. So, while Belarus hasn't yet formally joined Russia in a truly unified state, Lukashenko's Belarus has nonetheless been extremely loyal to Russia and Russian geopolitical interests.
Yeah, it definitely seems as if he wants to go that route. How long it takes and what it takes is another question, but it makes a lot more sense now. I was actually naive and lacking in knowledge of how close Belarus was to Moscow, but obviously that explains a lot in terms of why they're facilitating the easy passage for Russian soldiers into Ukraine. Quite sneaky, really, when you think about the fact that Ukraine is their neighboring brothers, effectively, and they're treating them like shit.
And so, Russia would ideally like to keep Lukashenko around there, in stark contrast to Ukraine, which eventually began drifting away from Moscow's orbit and towards the European Union and NATO. But that doesn't mean that there aren't cracks just beneath the surface within Belarus. Western observers have categorized every single election in the country ever since the 1994 one as rigged and fraudulent. And by this point, everyone in the country who's 28 years old or younger has only ever known Lukashenko as their leader and his authoritarian regime as their government, while also living directly next door to 3 European Union member states. So, after Lukashenko supposedly won re-election in 2010, protests broke out against him that were harshly repressed by the Belarusian police. Hundreds of people were arrested, including 7 out of 9 of Lukashenko's political opponents from the election. Among them, this guy, Andrei Sannikov, who was the guy that received the most votes out of
Obviously, they're probably meaning this dude here at the back, not these two.
all the opposition candidates, and who was subsequently held for 16 months and tortured before being pardoned and released in 2012.
This is crazy. You know, people are quick to kind of jump onto, and this isn't my opinion, this is just an observation, people are quick to jump onto problems in the Middle East, for instance, and have a lot of things to say about how they deal with things and do things and conduct themselves and treat people, humanitarian issues and all of that stuff. This country here is not in the Middle East. It's mental.
He fled the country in exile to London almost immediately after he was released, where he has remained ever since. The 2015 presidential elections were considered similarly fraudulent, with Lukashenko allegedly receiving more than 84% of all the votes. But there was less violence and mass arrests than in the previous 2010 election. But But then came the pivotal election in 2020, where Lukashenko's then 26-year-long regime was nearly toppled from power by internal pro-Western opposition groups. A complete nightmare scenario for the Kremlin had it actually happened. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya emerged as the primary political opponent to Lukashenko's regime after her husband, who had been running before her, was arrested and denied the ability to legally run himself. Tsikhanouskaya ran on a pro-democracy platform that advocated for freeing all of Belarus's political prisoners and terminating the Union State Treaty with Russia, which would have effectively ended all discussions on Belarus ever unifying with Russia. Fully expecting the 2020 election to be rigged like all of the previous ones had been,
Yeah, why wouldn't you? You'd definitely expect it to be rigged.
She urged her followers to use their smartphones to take pictures of their ballots and upload them all to a database. Those photos could then be compared against the official election results announced by the Belarusian government. And sure enough, the government quickly announced after the polls had closed that Lukashenko had supposedly won with more than 4.6 million votes, representing 81% of the total, compared to Tsikhanouskaya's 588,000, representing only 10% of the total.
Troops, we're talking about rigged elections and stuff like that. Now, again, I'm going to throw this out to you. Do you think all elections on the planet are rigged in terms of the numbers are manipulated to favour whoever they want in power? I mean, if it can happen in Belarus, obviously it's a little bit more obvious. Then it can happen anywhere. How do we truly know that who we're electing is the people that should be in power and that they rightfully won that vote? We just would never know. So what's to say that every single one of these types of elections are going down the same route? Because it makes me think and wonder sometimes if that could be the case. Troops, I'm going to split this into possibly 3 videos because it's a very, very long video. But this is pretty good, giving an insight into Belarus, why they might invade Ukraine, talking about the government elections and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's the first video for this bit. And, yeah, guys, thanks for being here. Make sure you smash the like, whatever you do, troops. It really does make a big difference. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because we've got some big, big news coming pretty soon. And I can't wait to share it with you guys. Be sure to follow us on Patreon. All of the ad-free, uncensored content is held there. And I'll see you in the chat. See you later, troops. Take it easy. Bye-bye.